Wars in American history are often flashpoints for rapid economic change. I mean, the Civil War essentially springboarded us into a full-blown industrial revolution, and World War II, spoiler alert, is going to transform our economy and military into a permanently outward-facing, booming global power. But Americans often skim past World War I and its impacts on the United States. Possibly because we were only in the war for a year, or possibly because it's kind of hard to isolate its impacts separate from the tail end of the Progressive Era and the onset of a global pandemic that disrupted life around the world. I wonder what that was like. World War I was an important moment for the United States to announce itself as a global economic power and a central figure in international politics. And at home, it provided a short-lived chance for people to gain new opportunities and experience in the increasingly modern nation, especially women and minorities. Now, with men going off to war, jobs opened up. 1 million women joined the workforce for the first time, and 8 million women switched to better industrial jobs. Now, when the war ended, most women returned home or to their previous jobs, but it began to plant the seed that women were, capable of holding jobs traditionally reserved for men. Women also were involved directly in the war effort. Although female physicians were outright denied jobs as doctors in the armed forces, thousands of women became nurses in Europe, working for organizations like the Salvation Army and the Red Cross, in addition to the U.S. Army and Navy Nurse Corps. U.S. Army nurses were actually the first Americans to arrive in Europe ahead of the U.S. military. Women also served as ambulance drivers, mechanics, and truck drivers, delivering medical supplies and sometimes driving through artillery fire to retrieve wounded soldiers. Side note, I know she's not an American, but one of these drivers in World War I was Marie Curie. She invented a mobile X-ray unit and equipped trucks with them, nicknamed Little Curies. By the end of the war, she had trained 150 women to be X-ray operators on the battlefront. Women served in communication roles, working telephone switchboards, relaying messages to the front. Although they were somewhat patronizingly nicknamed "Hello Girls," they received physical training and observed strict military protocol working near the front line. The only branch of the military where women officially enlisted was the Navy, thanks to some vague wording in the Naval Act of 1916. 12,000 women enlisted as yeomen, mostly serving stateside in administrative roles left by men. Throughout the Navy, they had the same responsibilities as male counterparts, and they were paid the same amount. What? Get it, Navy ladies? At the same time, Black Americans were experiencing one of the largest migrations in American history. Between 1914 and 1920, 500,000 Black Southerners moved north in what became known as part of the Great Migration. Henry Ford actually sent recruiters down to the South to bring agricultural workers to join his factories. Many Black people jumped at the chance to get the hell out of the Jim Crow South, and they ended up in industrial cities like Chicago, New York, Cleveland, and Detroit. Now, we should be wondering, why didn't more American companies capitalize on this cheap industrial labor from Black Southerners before now? Well, there's two answers. The simple answer is that they didn't really need to bring Black people into the factories much until most of their labor force, white men, went off to war. But the more complicated answer is that the war in Europe also basically cut off all immigration from the continent. So cheap labor that had been coming from more racially preferable groups, like the Irish, for example, now went away, and factory owners were desperate. I really wish the answer was that people like Henry Ford read Du Bois's books and had an epiphany about racial equality, but of course, that's not what happened. So World War I was important for establishing urban, cultural, and economic centers for Black Americans. But it also helped spark broader discussions about rights. I mean, Woodrow Wilson was traipsing around Europe yelling about making the world safe for democracy. Meanwhile, women and minorities were back at home like, oh, that's cute. Remember that suffragettes used that rhetoric to push for the right to vote. Why are we more concerned with the German Kaiser and the lack of democracy over there? Black Americans began making a similar argument. The Black press especially went after Wilson's ideas pretty hard. The Baltimore Afro-American wrote, quote, "Let us have a real democracy for the United States, and then we can advise a house cleaning over on the other side of the water." Basically, let's get things settled here before we go preach to other people about how to run things. And this was empowered by the fact that Black men were drafted into the military for the first time, and over 1 million men responded, with 370,000 Black men eventually being inducted into the American military. So Black men were eligible to fight and die, supposedly for democracy overseas, but then they had to return home to a nation that didn't recognize them as full citizens. Most of the Black service members were not assigned to combat positions. Those were deemed too important and honorable for non-white troops. Most black troops worked as manual laborers or cooks, serving the white soldiers. However, the military did create 2 black combat divisions. The 93rd Division was made up of volunteer black National Guardsmen. Not knowing quite what to do with them, and most likely not trusting their combat abilities, the US loaned this division to the French army for the duration of the war. They performed incredibly well. One of the infantry regiments from New York became known as the Harlem Hellfighters. They served for 191 days and gave up no ground to the Germans. The 93rd Division was the first to reach the Rhine River in Germany after the armistice. The Harlem Hellfighters became the first American soldiers ever awarded the French War Cross. The Harlem Division was also known around the Western Front for their jazz band that introduced black music to war-torn Europe, especially Paris, where it's really going to take off. Unfortunately, the other division of black soldiers, the 92nd, had a far different experience under white American leadership. The American Expeditionary Force was operating under Wilson's racist policies, and so they remained segregated throughout their service. White army officers even spread lies to French civilians that black troops were sexual predators. Let me clarify this. American officers were denigrating their own soldiers because even in war, I guess there's time to be racist. Many white officers saw the black men as a threat and discharged them or court-martialed them on made-up charges. But still, black men joined the military. For one, despite suffering from segregation and mistreatment, the military did provide black men some basic services and opportunities for advancement that they wouldn't receive as civilians, maybe basic education and healthcare. But more broadly, most African Americans understood that to be treated fully and equally meant accepting the responsibilities and challenges that came with American citizenship. For many, it was important to show the white majority that they were ready to be productive and beneficial countrymen if they would just be allowed. So World War I was providing new opportunities for previously oppressed groups, especially women and black Americans. But another aspect of the home front was the introduction of massive government oversight, really for the first time in American history. To be clear, the government is typically expected to take more control over the country during times of war. Like, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus and just straight up threw Southern sympathizers in jail with no trial because he believed it would help the war effort. But what Wilson's administration did during World War I was essentially a reorganization of the national economy to serve the war under the guidance of the federal government. He created a ridiculous number of wartime agencies to direct the economy and coordinate with companies, unions, and consumers. And this process was definitely shaped by the progressive movement. The idea being that when radical change was necessary, like shifting the entire economy to support a world war, the government should step in. They should put in experts or officials in charge and make the changes itself. For example, the War Industries Board coordinated all companies producing war materials, giving them guidelines on what they could produce, allocating raw materials, and sometimes even setting prices. Herbert Hoover ran the Food Administration, which monitored food production and consumption, making sure civilians weren't taking critical resources away from our troops overseas. The Fuel Administration managed coal and oil. They're actually why we have daylight savings time, so that we could utilize more natural light and reduce our electricity usage. By the end of the war, the US had spent $32 billion. This was partly funded by raising income taxes and taxing corporations, but over $20 billion came from the sale of war bonds. Government propaganda was a critical part of the war effort in all the nations at war, encouraging citizens to buy bonds, conserve resources, and join the military. The famous Uncle Sam, I Want You poster was first produced during World War I. But government propaganda wasn't just Uncle Sam posters. They established an entire committee on public information dedicated to selling the war to the public. They hired ad agencies, artists, songwriters, and entertainers to produce content to get Americans behind the war and the government. Nicknamed 4-Minute Men, over 75,000 public speakers were sent around the country to speak at theaters and public places, encouraging audiences to buy war bonds and report draft dodgers to the authorities. And fears over individuals and groups who might disrupt the war effort were a big concern. Recent immigrants, especially from hotbeds of socialism in Eastern Europe, labor union leaders, and straight-up members of the Socialist Party were often targeted as potential threats. Partly to co-opt some of their power, the government created the National War Labor Board, which dealt directly with worker demands to prevent strikes from disrupting the war effort. The government pressured industries to improve wages, to introduce an 8-hour workday, and allow unions the right to organize. And all of this was in exchange for labor promising not to disrupt production. In just 1 year, union membership increased by 1 million people. And on the surface, this is progress for labor unions, but it's progress that is highly controlled and managed for the benefit of the government, which isn't quite the revolution that Karl Marx had called for. Fear over anti-American activity got really bad. The Espionage Act of 1917 made it illegal to aid the enemy or interfere with the war effort. Fine, this makes sense, until you realize that interfering with the war effort is a really vague category that could just mean, questioning whether we should be fighting in the war. And the Sedition Act of 1918 went even further. This law made it illegal to speak against the war publicly. This meant that basically anyone who criticized the government during wartime could be prosecuted. Over 2,000 citizens were convicted under these two laws, mostly recent immigrants, labor union leaders, and other groups deemed less American. The fear was heightened by the fact that the Bolsheviks had just overthrown the Russian government, making leftist ideas a more real threat than ever before. Now, these new laws were challenged by groups who argued that they violated their First Amendment right to free speech. But in 1919, the Supreme Court supported the government in Schenck v. the United States, ruling that the government can restrict speech if it constitutes a, quote, clear and present danger. The defendants in question were two leaders of the Socialist Party who were sending out literature arguing that a military draft was a form of involuntary servitude, violating the 13th Amendment ending slavery. The Supreme Court was like, you can't say that. Socialist leader Eugene Debs was also a leader of this movement. He viewed the war as a pointless power grab that was just going to enrich those at the top at the expense of the working class, who were either fighting in the trenches over in Europe or struggling in the war factories back home. Debs was arrested for his anti-war speeches, but that didn't stop him from running for president while in prison in 1920. So in many ways, World War I was kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back for many different groups at home. Women got the right to vote, but women of color were typically excluded from this progress thanks to Jim Crow. Women entered the workforce, only to be mostly pushed out when men returned from the war. Black Americans gained some respect as they fought in the war, but often as exceptional cases that did nothing to really change people's views of most people of color back home. And workers got many of the rights they'd been pushing for, but only thanks to temporary wartime efforts directed by the government, meaning they could be pretty easily taken away. And the you-know-what is really going to hit the fan when millions of white male soldiers come home to find their jobs and neighborhoods looking much more diverse than they were when they left. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.